Great. Okay, so Ganesh, just give me a heads up if there is any lag in my video or audio or the presentation.
Yeah, sure, I'll do.
Okay, great. Cool. Hi, everyone, again. Welcome to the meetup. This picture is from the first meetup which we had like 3 years before. This is pre uh, COVID situation when the good old days when we used to have our in-person meetups. So this was organized in the Salesforce office. We are now starting to have in-person meetups as well. So stay tuned. One of the meetups in the upcoming months might be an in-person meetup. Okay, great. So what is today's topic? It's going to be CloudHub 2.0. So we'll be talking about some different aspects of CloudHub 2.0 from an architecture point of view. Okay, and it's hosted. So we are actually based in Munich in Germany. So we'll be hosting. So we belong to the meetup group in Germany. You can yeah, because you're registered from the same page, you can visit our page and look at other meetups as well. Okay, good. So to start with, so we have a few organizers. So I'm one of the organizer. My name is Chinmay Sahu. I'm based in Munich, Germany. I am a technical architect with MuleSoft Professional Services in EMEA, and I have been, associated and doing, MuleSoft design, architecture, integrations since for more than 4 years now. And we am one of the organizers and meetup leaders here in Munich, and I usually, love to say hi, hello to people in person, but unfortunately, I mean, this is an online event. So, hello to everyone. Hope to see you in person someday. Okay, Ganesh, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so hi everyone. I'm from Munich as well. So I have been working with MuleSoft for almost 7 years now with the technology, and I have been working as an integration consultant at UTA. So yeah, so welcome to the meetup again, and yeah, we'll try to catch up everyone offline soon, I guess.
Great. Cool. I'm not sure if Shakti has joined. So Shakti is one of our other organizers. Maybe he will join a few minutes later. Okay, so today's speaker is also going to be me. I'll be giving you a brief about and some interesting insights about CloudHub 2.0. Okay. Now, before we start, a safe harbor statement. So I'd like everyone just to spend 30 seconds reading through it. So the whole idea is we are just doing it based on our experience. It's not meant to be any for any promotional purposes for either us or our respective organizations. And we will be showing some solutions, some sharing some aspects based on our experience in the field. It might work for you, it might not work for you. Okay, so you just need to uh, understand the whole concept and then customize it based on your need. Okay, good. um, Let me move on to the next slide. Some housekeeping activities. As we have started recording the meeting, so this whole event will be recorded, and the same page that you use for registration, we will be publishing the recording within 24 hours after the end of this meetup. Okay, so because you have checked in already, you should have access to this recording at any point in time. Okay. You can use the chat options. If you see on the bottom side, you will find the chat option. You can use it to chat with everyone, the whole group. If you want to send some DM, you can use the DM. And when you have the questions, I think it's better if you post your questions in the Q&A section in the chat, so that it's easier for us to track the questions which we have answered, okay, and the questions which have not been answered. Okay, and let's make it more interactive, so you can post any question you have. In the end of the meetup, we would love to have your feedback, how we did. And yes, so please provide positive, negative, any feedback that you have. Okay. In between, if you have any problem with the network, let's say you're not able to hear me, if it's a problem in my network, I'll just drop in and then join back. If it's the same with you, so not you do not need to worry, you can just join back again. Okay, and if you are not able to hear the video or hear the audio or see the video, Ganesh, maybe you can post the BFE troubleshooting URL, so you can check this URL and troubleshoot it and join back. Okay, good. So what's the agenda for today? So we'll be making some important announcements regarding MuleSoft and the product. Then jump into the introduction to CloudHub. We'll talk about some key CloudHub features. We'll be talking about CloudHub architecture, and then we'll be having a quick demo of what we understood or what we talked about during the architecture, and then we'll have a Q&A. Okay, so the Q&A, you can ask your questions related to the topic for today. And finally, you can share your feedback, and then we'll do some networking in the end, and talk face to face, or at least on the screen. Okay, good. Okay, so let's start with it. Welcome everyone again. Right, so jumping to announcements. Okay, so there you might have received some emails. If not, then this might be a new information for you. So we used to have our training.mulesoft.com, where you could register for different trainings, your training courses, expert-led courses, your certifications, and self-paced trainings. Now, effective from 1st of February, you need to enroll into Trailhead Academy class. So if you go to training.mulesoft.com, it will already have that link for you, okay, in your own account. So you would need to create a Trailhead Academy account, and that will give you a Trailblazer ID for that account. All the expert-led training, so just the training and the courses, which are instructor-led or expert-led, will now happen through Trailhead Academy. Okay, you can find the catalog of all of the courses, and all the courses which will now be delivered via Zoom. Okay, Ganesh will be pasting the links in the chat, so you can save these links, or otherwise when we share this presentation at the end of the meetup in the same event page, you can take it from there. Okay, so yes, in short, yeah, so the training will be now in Trailhead Academy. Okay, so you need to have a Trailblazer ID account. On the other hand, the self-paced trainings, okay, that you already have, or your certifications, will still continue to be available on training.mulesoft.com. Okay, and as you will be using your training credits, so your training, I mean, for the Trailhead Academy, your MuleSoft training credits will be converted to Salesforce learning credits. Okay, effective 1st of Feb. So you can use this link, in order to check how to redeem those credits, or how to register for that course. Okay, so Ganesh will be pasting these links in the chat. Okay, so this is about important announcement about your training. So expert-led trainings, again, it will be through Trail-led Academy. Right. Another important announcement is about our a new product, which is Anypoint Code Builder. So its public beta version is now available. So it's a pre GA version. So the beta version is now available to public to officially use it. You can also, if you already have an Anypoint platform account and subscription, you should be able to see it in your account as well. Okay, so if you're an existing customer, please ensure that you ask your org admin to fulfill the prerequisites, which is you need to accept the terms and condition because it is a beta version, and you need to add those right permissions to your user role. Okay, so once you add it, then it will be available. Once the admin adds it here, then you would be available. You would be able to use the Anypoint Code Builder. Okay. For new developers, if you're signing in for a new trial account, you will be getting the Anypoint Code Builder as beta version directly, okay, in your trial accounts. There is a blog post how to use the Anypoint Code Builder. So there is this link which is available. There is also a developer tutorial, and there are certain Twitch live streams which are already available. Some of them has already been streamed. I think tomorrow in Pacific time there is another Twitch stream, so you can use this to learn more about Anypoint Code Builder. Okay, so this is officially is going to be our next generation IDE for developing integrations or Mule integrations and deploying the APIs. Okay. Great. Ganesh, I hope you have
I'm
added those
posting,
things.
I'm posting.
Great. Thank you. Good. So now we are done with the announcement. So let's dive into the topic for today. Right. So the topic for today is CloudHub 2.0. Okay. So I think everyone, most of you would be familiar with the CloudHub 1.0 product, or you used to call it as CloudHub. So what this product is, it's a MuleSoft provided, fully managed, containerized, very emphasis on the word containerized integration platform as a service, okay, or containerized iPaaS, which you now use to deploy your APIs and integrations as lightweight containers or pods, okay, in the cloud. So this is a fully provided and managed service provided by MuleSoft. It provides you different granularities when you want to execute your platform as a multi-tenant, or you can use as a single tenant. It provides high availability. It combines its own features with different other components in the anypoint control plane, like anypoint monitoring, runtime manager, anypoint exchange, access management. Okay, there are a lot of new features which are available in contrast to what we used to have in CloudHub 1.0, including an enhanced security package. Okay, so if you see the diagram, so we have the anypoint control plane, which is available in US, EU, or Gulf Cloud. Then we have the runtime plane, which is CloudHub for you. Okay, and it's a containerized one. Right. So now let's familiarize with some topics, because most of you would already have an idea of the CloudHub product or the previous product. So earlier we used to have virtual private cloud, or VPC. So now the new terminology is called private space or private spaces, or we can call, it's at least it contains the VPC aspect of a private network. Okay. We'll talk about in detail what is the meaning of a private space replica in the upcoming slides. Right. So just to familiarize, so VPC is now called private space. We used to have cloud of workers. Now we are calling it as replicas. We used to have dedicated load balancer before. We will now call it as ingress controllers, okay, or ingress load balancers. And then we used to have public worker clouds, okay, and now we are calling them as shared spaces. Okay, so private spaces, shared spaces, replicas, and ingress. So we'll be using these terms more often during this presentation. Okay, now to start with, why should we go with CloudHub 2.0? So there are whole different factors. So first, it provides, now it is available with a different UI in the same anyone platform tenant. You can visualize that all the different features in your own account. You'll be able to find private spaces. You'll be able to find a section where when you're deploying applications, it gives you an option to choose a CloudHub 2 deployment or CloudHub 1 deployment. Okay, so to start with, why CloudHub? So first of all, it gives you a much more faster initiation. Okay, so if you are if you just want to go into a vanilla account and you want to set up CloudHub 2.0 and you want to deploy an application, it's pretty quick. You just need to set up an environment. You can use the shared spaces, which is a globally available space, deploy your applications, and then you're done. If you want to use private spaces, which we'll talk about in detail, that will combine a lot of features which were manual activities when we had CloudHub 1.0. Okay, right. Then it provides lightweight isolation, because each of your applications will be is an individual container and has isolated set of individual resources dedicated to it. Okay, so each application works as a container, and you have different resource profiles, or vCore profiles, which you can associate with an application or a replica. Okay, it provides tighter security control. So there is a lot of enhancements and improvements which have been added for in terms of security. Because it's a managed service, it creates a lot of security aspects for you by default. Okay, when you're going for a CloudHub 2.0 construct, but nevertheless, it gives you more control by providing encrypting secrets, by providing different firewall options, and restricting access to APIs and so on. Low operational overhead. So this is my favorite part. Okay, so a lot of things which we used to do when we come from the CloudHub 1.0 background has now uh, operationally and from a maintenance perspective been reduced. Okay, we'll see it during a demo. But yes, so like for example, the load balancing aspects, the ingress aspects, a few auto scaling aspects have been already been taken care by the product itself. Okay, by the fully managed product. Great. Now let's move on to the next one. Okay. Right. So lower entry point and cost effective. So what this means is if you want an application to deploy an application, you just need to choose your granular profile, like a vCore profile. If you're not sure what is, what vCore profile you would need, you can start with the smallest one and then scale incrementally based on your need. Okay, so very cost effective. You have much more options for replicas, which we'll talk during the replicas uh, while explaining the replicas. Right, simplified egress controls. So historically, we always had an option to configure, make configuration for inbound connection for your APIs or how your APIs are consumed. Now it provides an also an option where you can also control the outbound connections or the egress connections. Okay, so it provides much more fine-grained firewall controls for also your egress traffic. So from MuleSoft or from CloudHub to any other application or SaaS application or any DMC. Okay. Now, overall, because I mean, this is very important in terms of security and compliance related, agreements. Now, so what overall, when we talk about these benefits, what this drives into? So it drives faster or accelerates the digital transformation because it is easy to set up. It has very, very simplified configuration and the future, and it has a future proof and scalable architecture. So you can scale in any way you want, be it a private space, be it an application, okay, or be it replicas with a clustering aspect. So overall, these are the benefits. These are the benefits of CloudHub 2.0, or why we should be choosing CloudHub 2.0. Okay, right. Now let's look at some of the key features. Now there is a whole bunch of features which have been covered in other meetups in different regions. But what we will be doing today is we'll be talking about the cloud of features which are key to today's topic. Okay, so because today's topic is about cloud of 2.0 architecture, so the features I'm going to cover is mostly about the topics which will be covered during the architecture. Okay, right. So Cloud Hub 2.0 in this vanilla format, which is shared spaces, is available in different regions. Okay, and in general, it's available in four global four global regions like North America, South America, European Union, and Asia Pacific. But if you go granular wise, so I think in North America there are specific regions, in European Union there are specific regions which you can choose to deploy your application. Okay, so what this means is you now have the opportunity to choose a location which is closest to your system of record or your application services. Okay, now for an application, so every application now, so when you're deploying it, it's always tagged to a region. Now the region becomes part of the application domain. So the way we call the application using a domain now has a reason, explicit region, both the lower region and the overall region associated with it. Okay. The load balancer aspect of Cloud Hub, it will be used or when it is configured, which we'll see in a few more slides. Load balancer aspect is also deployed in the same region where you want to operate your applications or where you create your own private network. Okay. Now, because in terms of control plane, we have the US, we have the Gulf Cloud, and we have the EU Cloud control planes. Now for the US and the Gulf clouds, so MuleSoft hosts the management console and the platform services in the US. And for the EU control plane, the MuleSoft hosts these platform services in Europe, okay, which is something which we already had. So these are this is about the shared global regions, which is available for Cloud Hub 2.0. Now, if you move on to the next, it's very, very important. So we'll spend some time in this slide as well. Right. So as I said, so CloudHub is available in these regions, and each of these region now becomes part of your application domain. So if you're familiar with the CloudHub construct, the way when you deploy your application, you have the default domain, which is called cloudhub.io. So this cloudhub.io remains, but there is a few new subdomains or domains which are associated with cloudhub.io. Now let's look at them in detail. So the first is, if you are looking at it, so first is my app, and there is a unique ID. So my app is going to be your application name that you choose for deployment. So let's say your application name is Salesforce SAPI. Okay, so this my app is going to contain your application name, Salesforce SAPI. Okay, the unique ID is an ID which is a 6-digit value. It's a random ID which is generated when you do the deployment. It's actually tagged to an environment. Okay, so when you're deploying an application using my app, so it will be my app plus an ID which is specific to an environment. So, so to say, if you have 5 applications for deployment, each of these application with different names will share the same unique ID because it is specific to an environment. Then the next part of the domain is called shard. So shard is a concept which is which is used for identification of where exactly or which space exactly your application is going to be deployed. So is it going to be deployed into a shared space, or is it going to be deployed into a private space? Okay. Each of these, so if you're using private space, which is a dedicated space, you will have the same value of shard for all the applications in that private space. If it is a shared space, because it is available globally, it could be the case that one region might have different shards as well. So you'll not have that uniqueness, but you might have that uniqueness, you might not have that uniqueness for different application in the same region. Okay. And then we'll have the region. So the region includes, if you see my screen, so if let's talk about 2 scenarios. Let's say if you're using a US control plane and if you're using a EU control plane. If you're using a US control plane, and let's say I'm deploying my application in EU Frankfurt, so I'll have DEU-C1 as my region. So this is now part of the domain. Okay. If you use the EU control plane for the same application, which you're deploying it in a EU control plane, then you would have EU1.cloudhub.io associated with it. Okay. Right. So just to iterate again, so when you deploy your application, each of your application is associated with a domain with cloudhub.io. This is the default domain. And with this default domain, you get a few more entries in the domain or as subdomains. So one is the application name, for example, Salesforce SAPI. Then you have the unique ID, which is a 6-digit ID, which is specific to an environment. Then you have a shard, which is specific to the space that you're operating in, either a shared space or a private space. You have a region, and then you have the cloudhub.io. So the region is based on the region you're deploying and the region your control plane you're operating. Okay, good. So then the load balancer of CloudHub 2.0. So there is a load balancer associated. I'll be explaining that in a few more slides. So the load balancer, which the CloudHub 2.0 provisions by default to route the request, is also existing in the same region as your application. Okay. Right, moving on to the next one. Now let's talk about replica. So we talked about shared global regions, we talked about region considerations and the application domain. Now let's talk about replicas. So as I said, so replicas, from if we derive it from the if we try to correlate with the CloudHub 1 context, uh, so CloudHub Worker in CloudHub 1 is replicas in CloudHub 2. Okay, so these are dedicated instances of Mule runtime where your applications are actually running in CloudHub 2.0 runtime. Okay, what these provide, so each replica has its own capacity, has its own resources in terms of memory, in terms of CPU. It has isolation, so each replica operates in its own container because CloudHub 2.0 in in its backend is a containerized service. So each of these replicas run in separate isolated containers. Okay, so you can club multiple replicas as clusters, but each of the replica in turn has its own resources. In terms of management, so each replica is deployed and monitored independently. Although if we are having an application with multiple replicas, both the replica logs of both the replicas or request processed by each of these replica will be available in the same application logs. Okay, but those would be can be monitored independently as well. We'll see that during the demo. Then locality. So yes, each replica either runs in a specific, definitely runs in a specific global region, and those global region could be US, or Asia Pacific. Okay. If we extend the replicas discussion, so as we say, so the smallest unit of your application is a replica. So when you're deploying an application, you're deploying that application. This is the resource that enables or gives you the ability to deploy your application. You can choose from different vCores which are available for you, and this is the matrix which gives you an insight of what is the vCore, based on which vCore size, how much CPU you get, how much heap memory, what's the total memory, and what's the storage that's available. Okay, so if you are deploying an application with point 0.1, you would get 500 MB of heat memory, and you would get 8 gigs of storage. Okay, if you're going for high availability, like deploying that application with point 0.1 into two replicas, okay, so you choose two replicas, so it will be deployed in two different replicas, each of them having its own set of memory. Okay, now replicas which are lower than 1.0 vCores, they provide limited CPU and IOPS for applications with smaller workloads. So if you have smaller workloads, definitely go for zero point 0.1, zero point 0.2, or zero point 0.5 vCores. These also provide a bit of bursting capabilities depending on the space that it is hosted, but it is unpredictable at the moment. Unpredictable because now that we are working in a cluster concept, we are working in a containerized concept, and containers are running in a certain space. It depends on the amount of resources which are available in that shared space or private space for the bursting capabilities. Okay, so if you are deploying your application relying on bursting, I would recommend please choose a higher version of vCore so that you would have a consistent performance. Okay, and if you're running replicas with 1.0 or higher vCores, then that would provide you much more performance consistency. Okay, and of course you'll get more memory and more CPU. So depending on your need, please choose your respective vCores that you want to help deploy in. Okay, now this provides, I mean, this basically replicas, what do they provide you? They give you the ability to improve the application startup time. So if you have a smaller or a larger vCore, so if you're going with a smaller vCores and with very smaller loads which have like some infrequent large workloads, then you can use point 0.1, point 0.2, or point 0.5 vCores. Okay, but if you need consistent performance, use the 1.0 or higher. Great. So we covered all the topics or all the features which we wanted to go into detail. But of course, there are other features as well, which I'm not going to cover in this meetup. But yes, you can find it in our public documentation or in other meetups. But I could go through like a single line for every for some of the features like multi-tenancy. Okay, because there is a scope of using shared spaces, which is like a global network. You can choose different level of isolation and security and tenancy. So if you want to deploy your application in different regions, that gives you multi-tenancy in terms of shared spaces. Let's say you are interested in an isolated network, so you create an isolated private space, it gives you single tenancy. Okay, high availability and scalability, it's actually part of your replicas design. So the way you make it highly available or scalable, with zero downtime and intelligent healing and redundancy and so on. Okay, with your replicas, you can cluster your replicas, and which would mainly then provide you much more scalability and workload distribution between the different replicas. which improves your reliability, okay, in terms of application processing, okay. And these capabilities, if you from the clustering aspect, if you want to look at what are these capabilities, where how you can use it, you can use it either through replicas or by scalable load balancing, which is available for you out of the box, okay. There is auto scaling available with the ingress controller, which we'll talk about in upcoming slides. App monitoring, automatic restarts, it's available. You can view the logs based on certain replicas. You can view, you can have the monitoring aspects and monitor the metrics of individual applications if you're using any upon monitoring. There is automated restarts. If there is any, there is a scope of, application failures, there is an automated restart as well. And of course, very important, there is enhanced security. So enhanced security, both in terms of the network and the application. Okay, right. So if you need any further insights into these features, you can look at each of these aspects in the public documentation, which is available in documents.mulesoft.com. Okay,
Chinmay, we have three questions. Can we cover it up now or can we do it later?
let's do it. Let's do it at the end. Okay.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Right. So now because we talked about the features, now let's talk about the architecture aspect. Okay. Right. So first, we have been talking about shared spaces and the private spaces for too long. So now let's understand what is a shared space and what is a private space. So shared space, you can call it as an elastic global cloud, okay, which provides you a set of resources which will have MuleSoft instances running. Okay, so if you want to have a multi-tenant type of environment, you can choose your private space, which is the vanilla construct that you get with CloudHub 2.0. Okay, so CloudHub 2 provides one shared space for each supported region. See, it's a supported region, as in North America, you can have a couple of regions or multiple regions. You can and for each region, you'll have a shared space. If I'm not wrong, globally, currently, CloudHub 2.0 in terms of shared space is available in 12 global regions to be exact. Okay. Applications which are deployed, based on namespace or based on applications environment ID. If you remember, we talked about the unique ID, which is associated with the application domain. So that is part of the namespace now. Okay. Right. Now, what is a private space then? So if your requirement is to have an isolated network or an isolated space where based on your need or your customer's need, where you will operate your application, or you want to extend that network to be connected to a private customer DMC or a private customer cloud, you would go with private spaces. Okay, so private spaces provides a virtual private isolated network, okay, where you can run your CloudHub 2.0 applications. Okay, when you are defining a private space, you define a region for the private space during the time of creation. Okay, and a private space is created and owned by a single customer, so it's a single tenant concept as opposed to the multi-tenant shared spaces context. Okay, once you create a private space, you create the private space at the top or the root level of the organization, then you can scale it across different business groups and environments available within your organization. Okay, good. If we do a comparison between shared spaces and private spaces on different aspects, so let's talk about from the level of isolation. So because it's a shared space, as its name suggests, there is no isolation in public cloud. Okay, so it's a pretty standard and global construct. Now, on the other hand, private space gives you the single tenancy and isolation that you need for a private network to operate your applications in. Okay. From a network connectivity aspect, you do not have an option to have your apps connect to any data center or any other cloud network. But if you're using a private space, you have the opportunity to connect using two different network connectivity methods, either a VPN connection or using a transit gateway attachment. Okay. So at the moment, because transit gateway is much more popular in terms of, the other network connectivity methods like VPC peering, because once you have the transit gateway construct, you can choose to have multiple internal connectivities. Like you can connect multiple VPCs to the same transit gateway, or you can also have direct connect to your own on-premises systems. Okay, so at the moment, yes, so we have network connectivity either established to your data center or cloud using VPN or transit gateway attachments, and this is possible with private spaces. Now, domain names, if you're using shared space, you would use CloudHub.io as your own domain. If you're using if you're using a private space, you can choose your own custom vanity domain. Okay, so any vanity domain that you currently own or your customer is owning, they can choose and they can create those vanity domains and associate those domains with the private space. Now, because we talked about domains, domains would be linked to certificates. So you cannot, in shared space, do not have the opportunity to configure custom certificates in the private space, but you have that opportunity, sorry, in the shared space, but in terms of private space, you have the opportunity to have, to, upload custom certificates based on your domains, which are going to realize your domains. Okay. And finally, in terms of endpoint security, so this is a very important requirement in both, which was in terms of CloudHub 1 and CloudHub 2. So if we go with the concept of API-led connectivity, or in general, if we categorize your APIs, so you either have external APIs, which can be consumed by external consumers, or you have internal APIs like your process and system APIs, which are doing your own business processes or are connected to your system of records, which are internal to it. So these are internal APIs which need not be connected from, should not be allowed to be connected from external or from internet. Okay. Now, shared space doesn't provide that granularity of private endpoints or having a private network for connecting to this application, but private space provides this opportunity to have private endpoints. Okay. We'll see more about how these private endpoints are configured in a couple of slides. Right. So this is exactly what I explained in the previous two slides. You can see, so now we have the endpoint control plane, we have the platform services. Each of these platform services, if you're going with a private space, so private space, you can consider this as a containerized concept. Okay, so in the backend, it's a full-blown Kubernetes environment, which is embedded within a VPC, within a private space VPC. This Kubernetes environment then provides dedicated resources. It has dedicated load balancers, network load balancers, and has private and public ingress, which we'll talk about now. Okay. Now, each of these clusters will now have your applications which will be hosted as containers or pods in Kubernetes context. And each of these applications will have different containers in the same pod, like one has an application pod and one has a monitoring pod. So you might be familiarizing this with the runtime fabric context as well. So it has the same context as runtime fabric in terms of Kubernetes. Okay. And this private space or this VPC can then be connected to any other VPC using transit gateways, or it can be connected to any data center using any point VPN. Okay, good. So I'll be explaining a couple of more slides, then we'll pause for some questions, and then we'll go to in deeper to understand the overall architecture again. Right. So when we are creating a private space, okay, so what does a private space look like, or what are the prerequisites to create a private space? So in each private space, as I said, it's a private network in a virtual cloud. Okay. The first thing which we need to associate is, where do we want to host this private space? Okay, which region globally? Okay, so you can choose any region. So for me, in the demo I'll be showing, I'll have my private network in EU Frankfurt. Okay, then you have the CIDR block, which you need to define, like you used to define in VPC's configuration in CloudHub 1. You'll also be defining a CIDR block in CloudHub 2. The difference here a bit is you do not have to worry about the association based on the IPs. Now, because it's a Kubernetes-based construct, the CIDR block will then be associated with individual subnet in that same cluster. Okay, and the subnet will then be associating those IPs to the application. Now, our product recommends to have a /22 as your seeder range, which you will by using which you will get a wider network and a much more scalable network. Okay. From a connectivity perspective, this is something which we covered. You can choose to have a connection type if you have a need of connecting to any private network, connect through VPN or through transit gateway. And if you have internal DNS servers, you still have an option of configuring your internal DNS servers in the private space. Okay. Right. In terms of TLS context, you can define those TLS contexts. You can define the domains, and you can optionally also enable mutual TLS in the private space. Uh, there are also options where you can go for last mile security. So what last mile security means is you can enable HTTPS till your application. Okay, not just terminated at the DLB level, but you can go even till the application. So that's last mile security. So yes, from the TLS point of view, or mutual TLS point of view, and these features are available. You can configure these based on your own certificates and based on your own requirements, security requirements. Right. When we are configuring the private space, which we'll see, there is a default TLS context which is already associated. Okay. If you haven't configured it with your own domain, it will get associated with its own TLS context. Firewall rules, very, very important. So earlier we used to have inbound and outbound inbound firewall rules in CloudHub 1.0 context. In terms of CloudHub 2.0 context, you get something extra, which is outbound. Uh, in order to manage the outbound traffic from CloudHub application to any consuming system, you get to manage the outbound firewall rules, okay, or the outbound traffic from your private space. And of course, you can associate your environments and business groups to the private space by creating the private space at the root level. Okay, right. So this was a brief about private space, but before going further, I will pause for a moment. Let's take some questions. Okay.
Okay, I think there are three questions in my first one is from Amrita. So it's about
Mhm.
CloudHub 2.0 versus RTF.
Yeah, okay. Let me, and everything is in the Q&A, right? Okay.
Yes.
So Amrita's question is CloudHub 2.0 versus RTF. Is it that CloudHub 2.0 is MuleSoft managed, but RTF runtime plane managed by customer? How else is it different? Yes. So CloudHub 2.0 has an equivalent construct like a Kubernetes construct because CloudHub is based on AWS. It's in the backend, it will be an EKS kind of construct. Okay. Whereas when you have runtime fabric, so now if you know the concept of runtime fabric with bring your own Kubernetes, you can choose any runtime construct for it. So you can, if you have Amazon, you can go with EKS. If you have Azure, you can go with Azure Kubernetes Service. If you have Google, you can go with GCP, or you can even install it using OpenShift. Okay. So CloudHub 2.0, because it's a managed service, it takes that complexity away from the customer. So if you have if you need very low, if you want to spend very less cost in terms of operations, so you can basically choose the CloudHub 2.0 option. Okay, good. So I hope I've answered your question, Amrita. Right. Okay. So now going to the next one. Okay. Shards are division of regions, and a private space cannot span across shards. Okay. So shards are specific to a private space. So there are two aspects to it. Okay. So region is you definitely have to provide it, and every private space or shared space is associated with a region. Okay. So you cannot deploy, without a region. You need to specify which region you want. Then the other part, if I can go back, let me go back to one of my previous slides. Just give me a second. So I hope you can, Ganesh, you can see my screen, right? The region
Yes,
configuration.
right. You are
Okay,
in the runtime pane.
right. So, like I said, so the region is definitely associated. So then you have shard. So shard is a, it's an identification which is needed for, which is available to identify a shared space or a private space. So if you have a shared space, if you're deploying application in a shared space, that might or might not have the same shard. But if you're using a private space, like a private VPC, private space VPC, all the applications which are deployed into that private space, it can span across different environment. You can have dev, test, and prod, and or let's say you can have dev and test, and let's say UAT, and all of these three environments you can have it in the same private space. And all the applications which are deployed, they will have the same shard. So if the shard is something like A, B, C, D, E, F, it will be the same for every application deployed within that private space. Okay, right. Let's go. I hope I answered your question. Let me go to the next one. Replicas can be deployed in different regions. So if you have your application, so when you're deploying your application, so you will be choosing an application to be deployed within a certain region. So one application, if you are having multiple replicas, all of them would be part of the same region. Okay, because application domain will be associated based on this. Okay. Okay, so Nishi Ganda has a question. Does AWS remain the infra provider for CloudHub 2.0, or there are any additional infra providers? Yes. So because CloudHub 2.0, as I said, it's a managed construct. It's not RTF. So in RTF, you get to choose which infrastructure you want, okay, or which Kubernetes infrastructure you want to host your MuleSoft services. For CloudHub, because it's a managed service, it's hosted in AWS on EKS cluster or Elastic Kubernetes services. Okay, so there is no option for customizations here.
Yeah, I think we are done. So we can move on.
Okay, any other questions? I can spend like 30 seconds. Okay, so containers in CloudHub 2 do not run in EC2. No, so because it's a so EC2 is a construct which is I mean it it was available in CloudHub 1.0, or you can have it with different RTF labels as well. But because we are talking about containers in CloudHub 2, and in the backend it's a EKS, it's a Kubernetes service with a Kubernetes cluster that runs the containers in the cluster, in the EKS, not in the EC2 instances per se. Okay, good. So let me move on to my next slides. Give me a second. Right. Where was I? Okay, so I was explaining the private space. Then I will, so this is one of the last slide. After that, we'll be looking at different diagrams in terms of the setup. Okay. Yes, so we talked about private spaces. Now, every private space is associated with uh, it's associated with a load balancer and associated with the ingress controller. Okay. So the network load balancer is a construct which is, under the hood. It's already available. We have no option of configuring it. That basically takes care of the network load balancing, but the application routing and the load balancing is done by the ingress controller or the ingress load balancer. Okay, so by default, when we are creating a private space, you have so when you have a shared space, first of all, all of the endpoints will be routed through something called as public ingress. Okay, so it will be, or every endpoint will be a public endpoint because you have no option of customization. But when you are creating a private network using the private space, you have an option of having a public endpoint and a private endpoint. So you can choose which application is publicly available and which application is only available internally. Okay, and this is configured in an ingress tab, which is available while deploying an application. We'll see during the demo. The other important aspect is this ingress controller. So like if you contrast it with what we used to have in CloudHub 1.0, the dedicated load balancers. So you associate the load balancers with certain workers, like 2 workers or up to 4 workers. In this case, CloudHub provisions these ingress controllers for you when you create the private space construct. And this construct has this ingress controller which can be auto scaled. Okay, so you need not be worrying about scaling in terms of very high traffic to your DLB. Okay, in terms of DLB scalability, so this auto scaling is available at the ingress load balancer level by default. So it's provided to you by managed service. So what this in turn provides you is, you have extremely less management overhead. You basically do not have to worry about the auto scaling aspect in terms of your ingress or inbound traffic. Okay, right. Another new feature, very, very, very nice to have, is the ingress logs, or the logs at the ingress level are now available via self-service. So in the Anypoint platform runtime manager UI, when you're configuring the private space, you have the option to download the self-serviceable ingress logs. Okay, right now, as I said, so this is now available only in the runtime manager UI. Um, there is no option for these logs to be forwarded because these are not application logs; these are ingress and external logs. So at the moment, based on the product, it is currently not possible to forward these logs to any external system like ELK or Splunk, but you can do the application logs anyways. Okay, so the application logs can be forwarded, but the ingress logs you still cannot forward it. It just needs to be downloaded from the UI. Okay, right. So that was about ingress. Now we will go to uh, we'll check three different aspects. So first we'll check how CloudHub 2.0 is embedded with the Anypoint platform. Then we'll look at, from a network point of view, what are the primary network components that a CloudHub 2.0 construct will have, or a private space construct will have. And finally, we'll talk about what is a good construct to have in a private space. Okay. So in order to do this, first I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment, and I will share the diagrams. So let me go back here. Okay. Let me start sharing my screen, and I will share the architecture windows. Okay, great. Ganesh, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen? The
Yeah, sure.
diagram.
We can.
Okay, great. Cool. So let's look at this construct first. So this is from a component point of view. How is Cloud Hub embedded in the Anypoint platform? Okay, just let me remove this. Okay. Right. So how is this connected with the Anypoint platform? So we have the Anypoint platform control plane. It can host it in the EU, or it is hosted in the US, or in Gulf Cloud. We have these components like platform services like Design Center, Exchange, Runtime Manager, and API Manager. Then we have the runtime construct, which is the Cloud Hub runtime plane, okay, or the Anypoint runtime plane for Cloud Hub 2.0. The way it is associated is you have your root organization, okay, in your Anypoint platform tenant. In the root organization, so it's always a recommendation to have your private spaces or cloud up or customized cloud up construct to have in the root organization. Okay, because if you have in the root, then you can scale it across the child business group. Whereas if you create in the child business group, you cannot scale it upwards or on the same level. Okay, so there is this root organization, and then inside the root organization, you can have different private spaces. So currently we'll be talking just in terms of private spaces context. So let's say we created two private spaces, one for non-prod and one for production environments. Then within the root org, you would have different business group. So if you can choose which business group you want to share this private space in. So if you're sharing this, let's say the non-production and the production's private spaces, so with a certain business group, let's say the business group name is finance, okay? And you have four environments. So let's say you have dev and test, which are non-production environments, and then you have pre-prod and prod. So where pre-prod is a production-like environment, In some customers, you can have pre-prod also as a sandbox environment, but it's just a choice. Now for this, we are just considering these two as production-like environments. So your non-production private space will contain the sandbox environment, which is dev and test, and the prod private space will contain the non-production, or the production environment, which is pre-prod and prod. Okay. Now, what it also contains, like I said, it contains a network load balancer, which the private space creates by default, or the managed service creates by default. You do not have to worry about creating it yourself. Whereas the ingress controller configuration, we'll look at it in a minute, okay, in the network diagram. Now, each of these private space, you have the virtual private gateway, which you can use to in order to connect to other networks. It can be a an on-premise network or a cloud network using VPN connections, anypoint VPN, or using anypoint transit gateway. Okay, cool. And there inside your environments, then you host your applications, experience system and process APIs, and these APIs will then be consumed by your API consumers. Okay. Um, respective based on respective environments, dev test or in productionized environments. Okay, so this is from a platform setup point of view. So there is the control plane, there is the runtime plane. You have the private spaces, you have the business group and environment associated with the private space, and you can connect to different networks using VPN and transit gateway. Now let's look at this under the microscope. So how does the private space look like? So we won't be going into the managed service, how EKS and everything works, but we'll be explaining from a network component point of view. So this is a network component point of view. So let's expand the private space part. So you have the runtime plane, and which is based on a specific region, let's say EU Frankfurt. You have two different private spaces. Okay, so let's say non-prod private space in EU Frankfurt and prod private space in EU Frankfurt, and each of them associated with a specific IP subnet. When you're creating this private space construct, uh, the CloudHub 2.0 managed service first creates a VPC for you, then it creates a network load balancer, okay, which will be the first point of entry, and then it creates a few ingress connections. Okay, so when you have these ingress connections or the ingress firewalls, you would get a public ingress and a private ingress. Okay, so now I'll be explaining the public and private shortly, but yes, so the public ingress, as its name suggests, it will allow uh,
Chinmay,
traffic to your applications from the public internet, and private ingress will be application to application communication.
Chinmay, would it be possible to expand the screen because the words are a bit scattered, I guess, for everyone.
Is it visible for you, Ganesh?
It's visible, but it would be better if you could zoom it through
Okay,
each.
I will zoom it a little bit now.
Yeah, it's visible.
Okay, great. Cool. Right. So, yes, I was explaining the public and private ingress. So let's try and understand this concept. So, let's understand it in a API-led connectivity construct. So, in API-led connectivity, you have experience, process, and system APIs. Okay. In terms of accessibility, let's categorize them as external and internal APIs. So, let's assume your experience APIs are external APIs, and process and system APIs are internal APIs. Well, in some cases, you can, if there is a internal application which wants an experience API can also be an internal API as well. Okay, but for the sake of this, let's consider experience as the only layer which can be exposed externally. So when you're exposing this externally, so through the external traffic coming from any consumers would first reach the network load balancer, then go to the public ingress. So this is the first traffic coming to the experience API. And let's say your experience API is calling to the process, and process API is calling to the system. Okay. So here the experience API, when it tries to connect to the process, because this is internal API to API communication, first thing which we need to do is block external access to process and system APIs. We'll see how it is done in the next diagram. But when Experience API wants to connect to the Process API, it will use the private ingress. Okay. Now the difference that you can see in both of these ingresses is the domain. Okay. In the public ingress, so let's say I'm a consumer who is consuming the API from a public domain. I will be using CloudHub.io, and there is the application name, the shard, the region, and so on. So giving an example, here is, I can expand this a little bit more. So you can see this is, let's say, Lemonade Experience API Dev. It has a unique ID associated. This is the shard 33DDHP. Okay. And this is the region, and it's hosted in the EU control plane. So you can see it is EU1.cloudhub.io. In contrast to that, when there is an API to API communication within your private network, which is a secure construct, you will be communicating using this domain. So let's say Experience API calls a Process API. It will be calling it using internal hyphen cloud.io, or the shard, which will be internal hyphen the shard, and then there will be region.cloud.io. So giving an example, you can see here Lemonade Experience or Process API Dev. Then there will be a unique ID associated. Then you have internal dash shard, okay, which is unique to that private space. And then you have the region and cloudhub.io. Okay, so this will then route the request to the Process API securely, because it's the request has initiated in an internal context. Okay, and then it goes to the System API. When the Process API calls the System API, it also uses, you can see the fourth channel. It goes to the private ingress, which is also the load balancer, and then goes to the System API. Okay. And the System API, when it connects to a system, let's assume that System API is connecting to a system which is located in a certain network, and you have connected it through VPN or transit gateway. So System API connection goes to the egress firewall. Okay. So this is ingress firewall, which is coming towards the application. And when the application or the Mule API is connecting to an outbound system, okay, in either a SaaS system in cloud or a system in your private network, it goes through the egress firewall. So you have an option to configure the egress controls. Okay. So it goes through the egress firewall and then connects to the respective application, databases, and system of records. Okay. So this is the overall construct. So how it's being called. Okay, we'll be looking at how the DNS resolution and others happen in the next slide. But yes, this is the construct. So do you have any questions now on based on this construct?
Yes, there is a question from Matthias.
Okay, so is there a way to know the DNS name of a service before deployment, or do I need to deploy first? Okay, so you can, so when you are creating a custom vanity domain, you're creating on the private space level. Okay, so once you configure the private space, the domain which is associated with the private space now then becomes available. When you're deploying an application, which I'll show in a minute, you get to choose which private space you want to use, and you can choose the endpoint, okay, or the endpoint domain, whether you want to use cloudhub.io or whether you want to use your vanity domain. Okay, so you can basically choose, the incoming traffic based on your vanity domains. Okay, also, is the unique identifier constant for the same app in different environment or private spaces? No. So when it crosses, so the unique ID is associated with each environment. Okay, so every app inside a single environment will have a unique ID which is common. When when you're in dev environment and when you're in test environment, so let's say you have an application in dev, you'll be having like dev hyphen Salesforce API, and in test you'll be having test hyphen Salesforce API. So each of them from the naming perspective will be different, and also they will be having different unique identifiers. Okay, and to explain this, let's look at here. Okay, so let's see, let's say there are different consumers. Okay, let's go with dev and test and prod. So when you have dev, you have your API will be, let's say, I don't know, dev hyphen Salesforce hyphen API. So it will be dev hyphen Salesforce API, and then it will be your domain, whichever domain you have for your customers or yourself. This will then be routed and in the customer DNS configuration. So the DNS server will then be routing it to this domain, which is your based on your application name, your region, and the CloudHub.io, specifically this one, okay, the public ingress. When you're going with a test environment, so your application name itself will be different. So because you are deploying an application in test, so you follow naming convention when you're deploying application. So it will be test, then your application name and your domain, which will then realize to the respective application in the test environment. Okay, it will go here. Instead of going to the dev, it will go to the test. Okay, and similarly, when you're going with API, when you're going with prod, of course, it's not a good practice to add prod in the domain name. So you can just add API name dot your domain. That will then route it to the prod ingress, prod public ingress of the prod environment. Okay, I hope that clarifies your question. Okay. Is there any other question on this? Okay, there is a question from Rajesh. What is the better way to have your private spaces at the root level or at the sub-root level? I mean, child business group, and what are the benefits? So, like I said, always it's a rule of thumb. We should be having all the primary configuration at the root level. Okay, because if you're doing at the root level, you have an option to scale it to the child business groups. Whereas if you are creating on a child business group, it cannot be scaled either on the same level or on the top level. It's not possible. Okay, good. Okay, so let me stop sharing my screen. Let me go back to the slide. So I'll explain one small concept, then we will go and look at the private and the public configuration, public ingress configuration. Now I will go back to my presentation again. Okay, so these diagrams are added to the presentation, so you can, once the presentation is available in the event page, you can just use these diagrams. Right, now because we talked about private and public ingress, so let's understand that. So there is this network load balancing, and then there is the ingress. So we'll be talking about the ingress configuration now. So these ingress, so every application will have, if you're talking about private space, will have a private and a public endpoint associated by default. The public endpoints are exposed to the public internet, which means any application which has a public endpoint can be accessed publicly. Okay. Then inbound non-HTTP based protocols are not supported. So currently we only support HTTP and HTTPS. Okay. So every network configuration that we currently discussed is based on HTTP and HTTPS protocols. Ingress service logs are available in CloudHub 2.0 in private space UI. I'll show that in a bit where it is available. Okay. Now, private endpoints. So private endpoints, so although it's represented as internal dash, and it only, from an endpoint perspective, it can only be, an API can only be accessed from within the network. These domains are also are resolvable publicly as well. Okay, so only accessible within private network, but they have public DNS entries. Okay. It is accessible within private network via an internal ingress, which is app-to-app communication, which we discussed. And this is the internal endpoint is visible in the runtime manager UI. So if you are creating a system or process API, you can disable the public endpoint, and then you can look at the private endpoint. Okay, good. Right. So we'll now look at the last representation, and then we will look at the demo of what we discussed. So everything starting from private spaces, um, starting from private spaces, ingress, and everything. Okay, I'll share the last diagram, and let's now understand. So what would be a good construct when you're creating a private space? So we want our external APIs to be exposed to the internet. We want our internal APIs to be secure. So how do we make that happen? Okay. So we already know that we have something called as a public ingress and private ingress, which gets provisioned by default for you. So let's assume that from the public internet, somebody is using your domain. So your domain, any domain you can use. I'm not using a wildcard certificate example. I'm just using an example with proper certificate. and you have the app name appended to it. So if it is, let's say, dev-salesforce API, this would be the app name which will be added here. Now, once someone API consumer calls using this domain, the call first goes to the customer DNS. Okay, then the server using the anypoint or the ingress CNAME, it then maps it to the shard and the region and the CloudHub.io. Okay, so it points it to the right ingress or the public ingress controller. Now, using this ingress firewall rules, you receive the request, or the name server forwards this request to the public ingress. And here you have the external DNS record is your app name with the unique ID, with the shard and everything. Okay, so this is already available. Now, this request, based on your application name that you have here, then routes to the respective experience API in the respective environment. Okay, then the experience API needs to connect to the process API and the system API. So when the experience API calls the process API, it goes again through the internal DNS. So there is no need to go for external DNS resolution, at least in this construct. So you go with the internal DNS record. So you use the app name and the unique ID and the internal dash. So this is very important. So internal dash is very important. It determines that this is the private endpoint. So you use the private endpoint to connect to the process API. Process API uses the private endpoint and the system API app name to connect to the system APIs. Okay, and again, the system API then connects to the external systems. Okay, so this is when you are receiving a request from an external system. Now, let's assume you have connectivity through VPN or transit gateway to your own cloud or your own DMC network. With that as well, so because once you connect to those network, that so CloudHub becomes or the private space becomes an internal network for you as well. So you use that construct, and if there are any application who want to consume CloudHub services, they would be calling using the private ingress. Okay, so the private ingress URL, which would be app name, unique ID, then internal hyphen shard. Okay, the shard is the private space identifier. Okay, and that will be through the ingress firewall rule. So you'll be configuring, when you're configuring the private space connecting to your network, you define the ingress firewall rules. What are the rules which would be needed to connect your application? Okay, right. So this is how, and a network, from a network perspective, you restrict your APIs. So external APIs, you have the public endpoint enabled. Internal APIs, you disable the public endpoint. Okay. Now I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let's start with a demo. Okay, so I have pre-configured every aspect that we wanted to show, just in the interest of time. But let's go through it together, and we see how is the private space configured and how the public and private endpoint are available. Let me first quickly check if I'm not logged out. So I'll log in again. Okay, I'm not logged out yet. Let me share my screen. Anypoint Management Center. Okay. So if you can see my screen, so I've deliberately kept some of the targets here or some of the CloudHub application just to show exactly how it looks like. So I have an application which is deployed with CloudHub 2.0. So you can see the target type is CloudHub 2.0. There were some applications which were already available before, and they were deployed with CloudHub 1.0. So you can see the target type is CloudHub. Okay, just to show you as a differentiator, I kept these applications currently available. Now let's go to the first piece which we talked about a lot. So we talked about private space. So here you have an opportunity to create a private space. Let me show you how a private space is created, but I will not provision the private space, let's say, okay, using the CIDR block. So it's pretty simple. You can provide your my test meetup space. So I'll create it. Now, after you have created, it's pretty simple. So once you have decided on the CEDAR block with the CEDAR range, which is recommended as /22, you can create your own network by choosing the region, so you can choose different regions from the different regions which are available. Okay, by default it is US East Ohio. You can change it to any other region. So if let's say I'm working in Frankfurt, I can choose, or I want my system of records are in Frankfurt, my consumers are in Frankfurt, I will choose Frankfurt as my region for a private space. Okay, and here is exactly where you define your CIDR block. The rules still apply. So do not have this network or this subnet overlapping with any of your network subnet in your own customer network. Okay, and use a /22, which is recommended. Okay, and once you click on create, it spins up that private space, which I'm not going to do now. Why? Because it will take often around between 20 to 30 minutes. Okay. Now you can ask me, okay, the VPCs and DLBs in CloudHub 1.0 were created pretty faster. Why is this taking 20 to 30 minutes? Is because it is creating the whole construct for you, which we saw in the previous diagram. It's creating the VPC, it's creating the network load balancer, it is creating the whole Kubernetes construct with the Kubernetes cluster. It is providing the right subnets. It is creating some static IPs. It is creating your domain, associating your vanity domain, doing all the work on the in the behind the scenes, and it is making it available for you. So I'm not going to create a private space here, but I'm going to show you a private space which I had created from before. Okay, right. So this is a pre-created. So if you click on that create button of the private space in the which I showed you before, it will create something like this. So here is my private space with the region EU Central 1. I have a CIDR block of /23. If you have internal DNS server to be listed, you can have it here for internal DNS resolution. And here is the part which we saw in the slides. Okay, so the private space then gets associated with a public DNS target. So the public DNS target here is, okay, so the public DNS target here is consisting of the shard, which is unique for the private space. So you can see this is I18GUG DUC1. So this is unique for any application which is deployed within the private space. We'll see a couple of applications. And this is the region that I'm deploying, the EUC1. You do not see the EU1 because my control plane, the one which I'm showing you during the demo, is a US control plane. Okay, and then CloudHub.io. Then there is a public DNS target. Okay, this can, as you can see, if I'm hovering over the information, you can see it can only be reached from inside the private network or through VPN gateway connections or transit gateway connections. Okay, so it has internal dash added before the shard. Okay, then there is a couple of inbound and outbound static IPs. Okay, so there could be some requirement where your API consumers would like to understand exactly where they want to send. So they might want their firewall regulation their outbound firewall regulation might need your inbound static IPs. So these are the static IPs which are available. There will be 3 static IPs which are available. Similarly, for outbound static, so let's say you are connecting to some other network. That network might have a firewall regulation where they want to put your IPs on an allow list. Okay, so they would need the outbound static IPs which are mentioned here. So these are provisioned. Everything that you see on the screen is provisioned by default. On top of this, there is this default TLS context like we talked about. So a default TLS context with CloudHub.io is already provisioned. Okay, and then you can see there is this internal domain, and then there is this public domain. You can, if you want to create your own custom domain, custom vanity domain, here is exactly where you add it. So you create your own TLS context. You can provide your public private keys. You can provide your your trust stores. If you want to add trust stores here and go with mutual TLS, you can define your own TLS context based on your need. Okay, so this will generate your vanity domain and associate your vanity domain to the private spaces. Okay, then there is the firewall rules section. So the firewall rules has inbound traffic and it has outbound traffic. As I said, in contrast to CloudHub 1, you also get to configure the outbound traffic provided there is a need. Okay, so with the current construct, I've just enabled my HTTPS traffic coming from anywhere. I can get any HTTPS traffic coming to my private space from anywhere. If I want HTTP connectivity or HTTP connectivity through HTTP protocol, I only want to allow my API to API communication within the network. That's why you see my source is the same domain, has the same subnet as my, will have a subnet which is equivalent to my network. Okay. The outbound traffic, I'm basically allowing my APIs to connect to anywhere. So my outbound traffic is anywhere, but you can choose from a set of rules exactly based on which protocol. Let's say I'm going with HTTPS protocol, exactly which network I'm trying to connect to if you have that need. Okay. I'm not going to save any changes. I'll just discard the changes. And here is where you choose. So there was a question from Rajesh before, how do you choose? So here is exactly where you choose where you want to share this private space. On a root level, you can share with, you can have it with this business group and its children. Or if you do not want to share it with every business group or every child business group, you can select the business group you want. Okay, so if you click on select business group, here you can select which business group you want to share this private space. And there you can also select, so if it is a non-production private space, I want to only associate with sandbox environments. Okay, if it is a production private space, you would need to associate with production based environment. So all the production environment in that which are associated with that private space will be linked to it. Okay, I don't need these changes, so I'll discard this. Then I will go to my advanced configuration, which is, exactly, this is the important part which I wanted to show. So here you have an option to download the logs from your ingress controller. So the ingress load balancers. Okay, you just need to do a click and it will download the logs. Okay. So this was about the private space. Now let's check how an application deployment looks like. So first I will share in general how your application deployment would look like. So when you try to deploy your application now, you would get a lot of shared spaces. So here you can see there is a lot of shared space which is available. And if I'm choosing a shared space, it's a global space where your application will be deployed. I'm choosing my own private space. If I'm choosing my own private space, it specifies the region because my private space is in EU Frankfurt. It will deploy my application in EU Frankfurt. Okay. And here you decide the runtime version, the replica size that you want. Okay, so here is the total memory of each of this replica mentioned. So you can go with, let's say 0.1 vCores. I can have multiple replicas. So let's say I want 2 replicas, and then you have an option to choose whether you want to run those 2 replicas parallelly or you want to cluster both the replicas for the same application. Okay, so if you choose cluster, run in a cluster mode, it will run both the replicas together as a single cluster. Okay. And then here is the important aspect. So because I've selected the private space, here you can see the host is called I1 the one which was present in my private space. At the moment, because I didn't have a vanity domain, I do not see any other endpoint here. Okay, so it gives me an error. But if you have another vanity domain, which I do not have in my private space, but I have a screenshot which I'll show you later, you have the option to select both. So someone can call your API publicly, either using the CloudHub domain, which is the CloudHub.io, or they can use your vanity domain to call it. Okay, or you can disable this and you can only enable your vanity domain. Okay, right. And here you see further ingress option. So if you have a base path, you can provide with with the path you rewrite, you can add the base path here. You also have the option, like I said, you can forward the SSL session, or you can forward the HTTPS till the application level using last mile security and forward SSL session if you're enabling these constructs. Okay, that would mean your application also needs to have a certificate, and it needs to be reached using HTTPS only. Okay. Then you provide your properties. The good thing, the other aspect with properties is, let's say I have a property called as sf.username, and I'm providing some random value. I have an option to protect it. Okay, so the safely hidden properties concept, which was there in CloudHub 1, now it's the protect concept here in CloudHub 2. So if I click on protect, it will go as a protected value and no one can see it. Okay, so it's not encryption, but it's protection. And then finally, there is the logging aspects. Okay, I'm not going to deploy any new application now, but let me show you the application which I had deployed before. So based on the construct that we saw, I'm going to use one experience API, which will call my system API. I want my experience API to be publicly available, and I want my system APIs to not be publicly available, to be restrictive. So if I'm going to my CS2 experience API, this is my experience API. I'll just go to the manage API. Let's look at how this API looks like. So once you deploy your application, you can see that there is a public endpoint which gets associated. You can see there is this app name. Okay. Let me see if I can expand this screen. Yes. So this is the app name, ch2-experience API. This YG66ZI. This one is the unique ID, which is associated based on the environment. I1 is the shared name or the name of the space, private space. And this is the region, and this is cloudhub.io domain. Okay, so Rajesh says that we are not seeing the right screen. I'm actually sharing the Anypoint Management Center. Are you seeing that, Ganesh?
Yes, I can able to
You're
see.
able to see this public endpoint, target name, and target type, right?
Yes, I can able to
Yes.
see it.
Yes, Rajesh, I'm still showing the runtime manager. So this is the runtime manager. I'm just expanded it for you to see the public endpoint clearly. Okay. Right. So yeah, so this is the public endpoint which is available for you. In the ingress, I'll show you the difference between my experience and my system API. So at the moment, my experience API has a public endpoint which is associated, but it also has a private endpoint. So if you hover over the private endpoint, which is written here, and as you see on the screen, you see there is another endpoint with internal and dash, then the shard value or the domain, cloudhub.io domain. Okay, so for API to API communication, this internal domain can be used. Okay, or for any private communication, this can be used. Right, so this is my experience API. Now my experience API is calling my system API. I'll just go to my system API. We'll make a couple of calls to my system API, to my experience API, and then see if we are able to see the logs. So if I go to my system API, it's the same construct. As you can see, this ID remains the same because both of these applications are deployed in the same environment. This ID is specific to an environment. And this also remains the same because this part is an identifier for the private space. Okay. Now in the ingress, you can see there is a public endpoint and then there is a private endpoint. Technically, I do not want my public endpoint because I want my system API to be restricted. Okay, so in order to do that, I can just I can just remove this public endpoint, which I'm not going to do right now, but let me show you. um, let's first try to call these APIs and then we'll see. Okay, so we'll first try to call the experience API, which will call the system API and return as a response. Then we'll try to connect to the system API directly. Okay, so I'll stop my sharing my screen, and then I will share the whole entire screen on my second screen. Okay. Okay. So Ganesh, can you see my browser, the complete browser?
It's loading. Yeah, it's visible now.
Now let me open my Postman collection. So if you see my Postman collection, so here I am using the Experience API call. Okay. So I'll be calling my Experience API and my Experience API will call the System API and return the response. And we'll see those logs now. Okay. And because I'm just using a timestamp which is based on GMT, we'll see the logs whether it has correctly processed or not. So if I'm calling my Experience API, you can see I get immediately get a response with the current GMT time zone. Okay, 17. So we see the GMT time zone. Now, if I want to call my system API because my public endpoint is enabled, I can also call my system API directly. See, I can call my system API and get the response from the system API as well. But this is not what we want. We want to restrict our system APIs. So what I'm going to do, so I'm going to go here and to my system API, I will just disable my public endpoint and I will click on apply changes. Okay. So this will now start applying the changes to it. And in the meanwhile, let's look at the logs for the experience API, about the calls that we just made. So if you see, this is my experience API. It receives a call. There is this call entry, and then it is calling the system API, and then there is this call exit. Okay, so this was the correlation ID. If we look at my Postman collection, when I was calling the experience API. Okay, so DF98, and here is the same correlation ID. So this has called the system API before. Now, once the system API now deploys, we will try to access that system API again. But in the meanwhile, let's try another aspect. So, okay, if I go to my system API, so I'm trying to access this internal endpoint or the private endpoint from internet. So I'm using my Postman as a client to call this. And this will not allow me to do that because it's a restrictive endpoint which requires the request to be originated within that private network. Okay. So this will probably get timed out in a few seconds. Right. So let's look at the system API now. So in the system API, if we go to the logs, so here you can see it is getting provisioned at the moment, but you can see based on all the previous deployments, the configuration is still available. Okay. So if we go to this log, so this was a log that that was with the request that we made before. Okay. So if you see, this was from the experience API. Okay, with the same correlation ID, and the 3BB3 comes from the direct call through the public endpoint that we made shortly before. Okay, this one 3BB3. What we want to do now is now call the system API again, and we should not be able to access it once it gets deployed. Okay, so let's give it a few seconds more. Okay, let me go to the settings. Okay, now it is running. Let me go to the logs. Okay, last successful, right? And I will now try to access my system API through the public endpoint. So you now see that it is trying to access it, but it cannot access it, and it gives F404 not found because I've disabled the public endpoint and it can only be accessed through experience API. So let's try that out. So I'm again calling through my experience API. Experience will call the system and return the response. So here you can see there is a correlation ID which starts with 8FF6, 8F6D. If I go to my application logs with the experience API first. Okay, so here is the same request DF6, and if I go back, sorry, 8F something, and if I go back to my system API, you can see this 8F6 request which has come from the experience API itself. Okay, so what we try to do right now is block the external connectivity or the allowing our external API, internal APIs to be consumed from an external traffic. Okay, very very important for a public private space construct or an isolated construct. Good. So if you have questions, so just add it to the channel. I'll now go back to my screen. So just to show you a last piece of how it would look like in a vanity domain construct. I'll stop sharing and start sharing again. Share.
Yes.
Right. So we talked about this. We talked about private spaces ingress. This is the exact construct which we created. And this is exactly how it looks like when you have a vanity domain. So when you have a vanity domain, you can see that in the public endpoint, or even here in the public endpoints, so let's say my vanity domain is called mulelabs.co.uk, okay? And my API name is users.experience API. So you can see there is this vanity domain available as a public endpoint. So API consumers can either use the first domain to call the API, or they can use this domain, which is the CloudHub domain, which is users experience API, to call that API. Okay. So because I didn't have a vanity domain, I just wanted to take a screenshot of an existing construct and showcase this to you. Okay. So while you're deploying your application, you can choose which public endpoint you want your consumers to be able to consume your API for your external APIs. Okay. Great. So I think we are done with today's discussion, or the major part of today's discussion. So we went through the demo. Now let's go through some Q&A. Let's look at some questions. So do we have any questions now?
Yes, Chinmay, we have two questions.
Okay, right. Just give me a second, please. Yes, okay. So here is Jonathan's question. So we can retrieve ARM properties of a previous deployment, like SF username, same for password. Yes, so let's say you have a property which you have used for, which you have protected using the ARM. Now, once you have enabled protection, you won't be able to get that value directly anymore. Okay, so you can't get the actual value anymore. So it's important that so for certain properties. So let's say you are using the secure properties toolkit for securing or encrypting the properties, and while deployment, you want to have those property to be listed. Okay, in order to decrypt the credentials or decrypt the secure properties or encrypted properties. Now, things like that, any secure properties, if you're protecting, it's better to protect it in this way. Okay. Or any let's say you are deploying any application, you would need the environment or the business group client ID secret. Okay, because that is an information which can be readily available. You can add it in the any runtime manager properties, and then you can restrict it or protect it. Okay, but bear in mind that once you protect it, you can't retrieve the actual value. So it's important that these properties that you are specifying in runtime manager, you have these properties listed somewhere. Okay, right. I hope I answered your question, Jonathan. Right. Okay. Then one question from Nishiganda. Are there any changes in terms of object store, VM queues, anypoint MQ, in terms of added restricted features or capacities? So I won't say that. So definitely there are a few changes. I won't be able to say the exact changes in terms of object stores or VM queues. I mean, for example, there is a slight change in terms of the schedulers that we used to have, the way they used to function. But yes, I think in terms of features being available, features not being available, uh, it's available in our public documentation. Or if you can just scan through other meetups in different regions, I think they have actually covered it before, where they have compared the CloudHub 1.0 and CloudHub 2.0 and specified the new changes. Okay, we didn't have time to cover it because we wanted to cover today's architecture. But yes, if you have any specific question, you can just reach out to the speakers and organizers. Okay. Question from Siba: is there any special setup required for third party logging and Splunk? If I'm not wrong, Christina is there in the call, but yeah, if I'm not wrong, I think it would be the similar kind of setup that we used to have using when you use CloudHub 1.0. Okay, but yes, I will. Sorry, Christina, are you there in the call?
Yes, I am. So yes, you're right. So it's similar to CloudHub 1. You can add additional log appenders in the log4j. What's different compared to CloudHub 1 is that you do not anymore need to request via support case as you did with CloudHub 1 to say, hey, I want now my custom log4j to be taken into account. That works now out of the box for CloudHub 2.
Great. Right. Yeah, so the enable application logs thingy, which we used to request. Great. I hope that answers your question, Siba. Okay, so another question from Jonathan. When deploying with properties as params with hyphen mule deploy, can I still use mule artifact.json secure properties to list secure properties before deployment? Okay, is this a question you can answer, Christina, from a secure properties point of view?
I believe it looks slightly different. I think it's not exactly in the same format anymore, but you have an equivalent of properties that are masked.
Right.
It's not
Yeah.
it's not exactly the same. You might have to make some adjustments.
Yeah, so that could be some adjustment because when we're talking about secure properties using Mule Artifact, we're talking about the safely hidden properties. Okay, so because the way we are handling them in the ARM is different from what we used to have in CloudHub.io, I believe it would be different. So maybe so it definitely should be available in a public documentation. You can get that answer, but if you don't get it, please reach out to me again and I can provide you one. Okay.
Should be in the documentation for the Mule Maven plugin. What the exact name of those parameters is, I don't know by heart now either.
Yeah, okay. And the same goes for your other question as well. Okay, so exact details about the deployment of the Mule Maven plugin will be available for the cloud deployment for 2.0 with Mule Maven plugin. Okay. Matthias has a question. In CloudHub 1.0, you could set up mapping rules in a way that only experience APIs would be reachable publicly, while others are simply not mapped. Do I understand it correctly that CloudHub 2.0 does not allow such a restriction as anyone could define a public mapping for their system APIs? So yes and no. So the way CloudHub 2.0 is created, so you do not have to worry about defining or routing based on this naming convention, but you create you create the private space once, but while deploying an API you decide whether this API is a public API or this API is an internal API. If it's a public API, you keep the public endpoint. If it's an internal API, you just need to disable the public endpoint. Now, regarding mapping, like if you have certain base path, so there was this attribute called as path rewrite. So you can add your base path or your own customized path for that application in that section. Okay. So you won't need this construct because the way CloudHub 2.0 provisions the private space, you won't need to create a DLP mapping rules anymore. Okay, so this is now application specific. For every application, you decide what the endpoint is and what is the URL. Okay, cool. Any other question? Okay, and Christina has pasted the Mule Maven plugin secure properties in the chat. So Jonathan, maybe you can have a look at this link. Okay. Cool. Okay, so let me see if there is any further question.
Yeah, there are two questions.
Okay, how fast is autoscaling? Does autoscaling require the container to restart? Example, a flow receives an unusual amount of input data to process. So yeah, so so there are two aspects. So if you're talking about I believe you're talking about the bursting capabilities. So as I said, the bursting capabilities here in this case will be in unpredictable because we are talking about a private space. So it's a common space with resources and clusters, and it would depend on the amount of usage in your or resources available in your private space. So we cannot predict if you are relying for an application deployment or an application performance only based on bursting. I would recommend go for the higher version of vCore for that application rather than relying on bursting. Okay. Then the other aspect of auto scaling, which is related to the ingress. So the ingress auto scaling part, which is from a network perspective, so that is scaled by default by the managed service. Okay, you do not there is no configuration needed, and there is no configuration possible, but there is no configuration needed per se. So it is auto scalable. Okay, another question, if I understand it correctly, with my improved security aspect, will my experience APIs only be HTTPS based? So you can make your experience API HTTPS based. So you can basically choose what your experience API would be called with. The recommendation would always be HTTPS. But let's say you are doing some POCs and you want to enable HTTP traffic as well, you can have you can create the inbound firewalls based on the same and probably deploy that API in a shared space rather than a private space. Okay, so depending on your need, you can define it. But all of this configuration can be done in the inbound in the firewall rules for both inbound and outbound configurations. Okay. Neha Sharma has a question. Is there any payload size limit for CloudHub 2.0 ingress DLB? If yes, can we increase or alter the limit? So technically speaking, I don't think there will be any alterations which would be possible, but I don't know the exact limit of payload. Maybe this is available in a public documentation. But yes, this is something which, because it's a very specific technical question, we need to check it out. I do not have the answer for this. Okay, cool. Okay, can EU control plane deploy to, so you have an EU control plane, you are deploying to US or US or
Japan.
Japan? Okay. Christina, do you know the answer to this? I think we need to have the control, the runtime plane also in the EU, if I'm not wrong, if the
Yeah,
control plane is EU.
yeah, I believe it's still the same as in CloudHub.
Yes. Yes, yes. So if you're using EU control plane, you would have the runtime plane as only available in the EU. In contrast, if you have it in US, you can have it runtime planes globally. Okay. Okay. So I think we are done with the Q&A. And thank you so much for your patience, and hope you're able to get some enablement about CloudHub 2.0. Let's go to the last few chapters of this. So what we would like to now get is your feedback and maybe some next topics that you would like us to present or you would like to present in these meetups. Okay. So if you could log into menti.com and use this joining code. So Ganesh, if you can paste this link and the joining code in
Yes,
the chat.
yes. So I did.
I'll stop sharing my screen so you can share.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So please provide provide your feedback. Okay, Jonathan has a question meanwhile. So Jonathan, yes, we recommend /22. Maybe in the diagram we just added /24 or /22. It basically is based on your need, but we recommend to have /22 for every every specific environment, because if you're going with non-prod, you will probably have multiple environments. If you are going with prod, you'll have a single environment, or maybe a couple of environment considering pre-prod. So always stick to /22 will be my recommendation. Okay, last one. Okay, do you support TLS 1.3, HTTPS 2.0, 3.0? I think we support TLS 1.3 if I'm not wrong. Regarding the
Yeah.
HTTPS, do you have any views, Christina?
Yes, I just wanted to confirm that's also my knowledge that we support TLS 1.0.
Okay, and the HTTPS 2.0, 3.0 as well. Okay, good. So
Okay.
please provide us your valuable feedback. So we are basically surviving on feedbacks. We'll try to make it even more better and even much more interactive, if you feel the need to be.
Yeah, I think we're already receiving a very good feedback. So it's a very informative session. So we have a lot of feedback. We'll just wait for another 30 seconds, then we'll go with the next slide.
Sure. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Really great feedback. Okay. Insightful, informative, very informative. Thank you so much. Okay. Now let's move on to the next one, which is you can share some topics which maybe you would like to present or you want us to present in the upcoming meetups. Ganesh, if you could go to the next
Yeah,
one.
sure.
Okay, so now you should see in the same window where you can propose different topics, or you can, share a topic and you can let us know that you want to present that topic in one of our meetups. So we can organize the same at any point in time. Okay. Flex Gateway. So we actually did a Flex Gateway. One of our previous meetup, or the meetup before this, was actually Flex Gateway, and it is, and I believe the recording is already available in our website. But if you have any
Yeah,
specific context that you want to understand from a Flex Gateway, for example, let's say in local mode or connected mode, or you want to see how it works as an ingress controller or how it is hosted on a VM, do let us know. Okay. Okay, any point data graph. Okay, something definitely to consider. RPA, yes, definitely. This is somewhere we are also looking forward to. Okay, so we'll try to organize this once we have the content and once we have a good demonstration ready. Okay, any point code builder, yes, we will have it at some point once it is publicly available as a formal go live. Now it is available as a beta. Partner Manager, yes. So Partner Manager is a meetup. I think most of you would have already seen an email today morning. There is a Anypoint Partner Manager meetup coming on 15th of March. Okay, so please join in if you are interested in EDIs, B2B integrations, for your, for yourself or your customer. Okay, deployment automation on CloudHub 2.0. Yes, this is something which we are looking forward to. I think the team is working on it, and once something is available on the knowledge base and we get that insight, we'll definitely try to organize it. Okay, batch processing or GraphQL. Okay, so thank you for your proposal. So if there is any of the topics which you would like to present, so please use the general channel now, and please type it down that you would like to present this topic, and we will reach out to you separately and we'll try to organize it where you can speak about this topic. Okay, and we'll finalize one of the topics from the set. Okay. Great. Okay. So thank you so much for this, Ganesh. I'll take the screen now.
yeah, sure.
Okay. Last few slides, I promise.
Yeah, just to wrap up, we'll enable all the presenters to.
Right. So before we enable everyone as a presenter, Ganesh, please wait for a second. So,
Yeah,
our next meetup is on 15th of March. It's B2B integration with MuleSoft. Because you are already registered with our account in Munich Meetup group, you should have received that email. So please join this if you'll get really good insights of how to do B2B and EDI integrations with MuleSoft and Anypoint Partner Manager. Please use you can share this link to any of your network, and you can share it anywhere you want, and please scale it off your network so that we can increase our community in for this meetup community. Okay, if you have any feedback, just go to the event page, and there will be a button called as contact your organizers. Just click on it and send us your feedback. You will be able to find this recording first in the meetup page tomorrow, hopefully by tomorrow, and also in a YouTube channel. And the YouTube channel is called MuleSoft Meetup Munich. Okay. If you're interested as a speaker at any point in time, just give us an email, or just click on that contact your organizers and reach out to us. You can also reach out to us in our LinkedIn profiles, which is MuleSoft Munich Meetups. Okay, great. Now we are done with this meetup, but we would, if you would wait for a few minutes, we could take a group picture and we could have some networking time. Just a word of caution. So we will be making everyone as presenters now, but if you are leaving after that, please do not click on end event for all. Okay, just leave the event or just close the browser. Please do not click on end event for all, otherwise it will be closed for everyone. Okay, cool. I'll stop sharing my screen.
I think it's time for everyone to turn on their camera.
Yeah, so you can feel free to turn on your camera, and you would also have speaker access, so you can speak as well. Okay, I'll start making others presenter.
Hello.
Hello, hi Jonathan. Thank you for the nice questions. I hope you had, good answers for these questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, presenter mode on, presenter mode on. Okay, so I hope if you like, you can turn on your camera and then we can take a picture. Okay. Anybody else? Okay, so Hitesh, I've made you a presenter. Martha, I've made you a presenter. Monica, I've made you a presenter. I mean, you would now be able to see the camera and the microphone option. Okay, so feel free to choose and turn on your camera. Great. Cool. Hey, Jonathan. So where you based, Jonathan?
So I work in the Luxembourg office of CloudHub, and
Okay.
I'm living in Belgium at the
Okay,
border.
awesome. So you must
Nice.
be knowing
Edward,
Edward, right?
yes.
I must?
So you must be knowing Edward.
Yeah, I
Edward.
know Edward.
Yeah. Okay. So he is still one of the meetup organizers here, but I think he relocated to Luxembourg, or
Mhm.
yeah, Belgium some days before. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Good. Cool. Hey Siba, nice to meet you.
Hello everyone, nice to meet you.
Yeah, I know you're residing in Munich. Okay. Okay. Great. So maybe we can. So others. Sayali, Pratik, Neha, and Monica, if you turn on your cameras, we can take one picture, if that's okay with you.
Sorry, I'm in security, see, so I'm not allowed to.
Oh,
So that's why I
okay.
didn't do that.
No
Sorry.
problem. No problem. It's absolutely fine. Okay. And there is Rumana. Hi, Rumana. Oh, did Rumana join and drop off? I don't know. Anyway, so Ganesh, can you take a picture here?
Yeah, sure. Just give me a minute. So, everyone, please say cheese and go over the picture. Let's see. Okay. Cool. Then,
Okay. Cool.
thank you so
Awesome.
much. Thank you so much.
Great. So if anyone wants to